interested in, but obviously it's unrealistic to talk about everything in 1 hour, right? But we'll have time for questions and discussion. And now it's an interesting time to talk about Russia to Chinese. So I think you're all Chinese, right? Some from Hong Kong and others from mainland, because as you, I'm sure, well know, Russia is sort of reorienting its interest and focus on Asia and China in particular, right? I mean, so Russia is, I'll talk about the anti-Western moods in Russia and shift towards sort of shift of interest, political and economic, towards China, and whether, you know, what can we expect from this? So besides, you know, beautiful horses and women in Russia, you know, there are a lot of more interesting facts. As you might know, Russia is the largest country in the world. Yeah? It's almost twice the size of the United States, territory-wise. It's not obviously the largest country in terms of population. Yeah, so again, obviously China is bigger, but it's still in top 10. There are slightly more than 140 million people living in Russia. And if you look at the map, yeah, people tend to live in a very sort of, you know, in a concentrated manner. So all this area of Russia is largely deserted. Right? And, you know, a lot of Chinese businessmen and a lot of people in Chinese government are quite interested in, in some of these areas in terms of investment and exploration, expanding into these areas. And this is currently, you know, part of the talks between two countries, you know, leasing land and things like that. So obviously, especially sort of, you know, south east of Russia is to a large extent depends more nowadays on China and on Japan than on Moscow, right, the capital of Russia. Russia is extremely rich in resources, which is also an attractive feature of Russia. There are self-sufficient in most of the metals. I'm sure you know about oil and gas, timber, water. So again, water, 25% of the world fresh water is in Russia. In terms of political structure, Russia is a federal state, somewhat similar to the United States. It's a republican form of government. With the latest constitution adopted in 1993, it has two-chamber legislation, upper and lower house. Lower house called Duma. And there are 83 republics and regions represented in the parliament, in the Russian parliament. Again, the president, who is serving his third term now is Vladimir Putin. He was last time he was elected. His term has been extended from 4 years to 6 years now. Yes, there were some amendments to the constitution. So he's expected to serve until 2012, and then we'll see what's going to happen then. Yeah, so in theory, he can serve another term after that. So he's not restricted, to continue. The government of Russia is appointed by the prime minister, who is Dmitry Medvedev now, right? Who was the president in between Putin's terms. Yes, it was Putin, then Medvedev, then Putin again. So his close friend. And there are different parties represented in the Russian parliament, but the major party is called United Russia. And it's united behind Putin, right? It's united to support Putin. We joke about that, and that's the main purpose. There's no sort of ideology, unlike in China, there's no clear ideology in the sort of Russian politics, right? In the ruling party, meaning that it's not communism, right? It's not socialism, so it's very sort of, it's hard to define, right? But there are other parties. So there's a Communist Party of Russia also represented in the parliament. There are some other parties, but most of these parties are supporting the ruling party. So there is no true opposition. There are very few sort of representatives of the true opposition. Yeah? So very often these parties are referred to as a non-systemic opposition, right? Which means that they're not opposing truly, the ruling. So I mentioned the reasons why Russia is of a lot of interest for the rest of the world, and why is it important geopolitically, gains, the China large population, vast territory, and natural resource wealth. And again, we have to be honest, we have to also mention the nuclear missile, right? It helps to be important in the global environment. When you have nuclear weapons, then that's also a factor. Russia is the country which came from the socialist/communist background, right? So, in a lot of sense, it's still transforming its economy. Similar to China, the country went from the centrally planned system to the market economy. And this process is not complete yet, in the sense that Russia, has modernized its economy, and that was the purpose of market reforms, but it still falls short in terms of policies and institutions. And so there's a lot of room for improvement, but again, one has to be realistic. One has to look at these things from the historical perspective. Just in the beginning of the 90s, Russia was a centrally planned economy. There were no markets, there were no banking system. Again, it's easy for me to explain it to you guys, right? You know exactly what I'm talking about. So everything has been created from scratch. Yes, centrally planned system means even prices were determined by the central government, right? There were no market-determined prices, there were no entrepreneurship on a large scale, at least. Men's shoes or something, and that was the biggest entrepreneurial project one could do. So, in a sense, what the country has done over this since the beginning of the 90s, is a tremendous change. The country has changed a lot. If you were in Russia, you could see, the changes. So I'm sure you will have an opportunity to do it one day, and you'll be amazed, right, by how modern Russia became in many respects. So again, I always say to foreigners, to Americans, that nowadays, they tend to think about Russia from the Hollywood movies, where everything, people in funky hats and having a bear on the leash, in the street. I mean, it's not like that. You can find Starbucks, you can have sushi, you can have Chinese food, you can have Indian food. It's in that sense, it's a normal country. Especially if you have money, you feel good in Russia, right? I mean, any country looks good from the, when you drive Mercedes, you look out of the window. But again, that's not our focus, right? Our focus is the business potential of Russia. Can you make money in Russia, and how will it change the country? Because in some countries you can make money, but then the country goes downhill. So over here, is there long-term potential in investing in Russia, and in what areas? Again, if I was giving you this talk 2 years ago, right? This talk would be very different from now. The forecasts, before 2014, people I would talk about BRICS economies, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, being the driver of economic growth and the global economic growth, huge potential, overtaking developed countries. And partially still true when it comes to part of the countries in this group, like India and China. Even though China is slowing down, it's still an important part of the global economy, and there is a huge potential. When it comes to Russia, things change. So first of all, Russia political, economically, so it required a lot of reforms, it was slowing down. Because of the problems, the sort of corruption, inefficient institutions, etc., various problems which we will mention. And then what happened is Ukraine and Crimea. So you know that the general story I'm sure you're aware of. So what happened is that at some point, well, let me give you a background, short background. Ukraine, because I'm going to talk about this because it's impossible to look into the Russian future without talking about this factor, which is a critical point for the future developments. And it creates a lot of uncertainty. So Ukraine is the part of the Soviet Union. So Ukraine and Russia used to be part of the same country. So Soviet Union was a much bigger country, over 200 million people, and consisted of 15 republics. Ukraine and Russia were just one of these republics. So in 91 years, so in the beginning of 90s, the Soviet Union was dissolved. So all these republics decided to become independent states. So did Ukraine. Russia was the only country which retained nuclear weapons. So Ukraine had nuclear weapons, right, when it was part of the Soviet Union, but when Soviet Union broke down, Russia took all the nuclear weapons, and in exchange they signed an agreement with Ukraine that, that they're not going to dispute any territorial issues. So the borders will be intact. That was it. But obviously Ukraine, because of the close economic ties to Russia, Ukraine remained dependent on Russia. So gas transit to Europe went through Ukraine, and Ukraine was getting some money for transit fees, for gas. And economically, it's very much integrated with Russia. It's also very similar culturally. So in a sense, Russia always treated Ukraine as almost part of Russia. Yeah? Like younger brother, yes, we are different, but we are still like one family. And I'm older brother, so I can tell you what to do. Ukraine was also not as rich as Russia. It was relatively more poor. Then one day, again, the government in Ukraine was as corrupted, or maybe even more corrupted than the Russian government. So at some point, and then the political situation in Ukraine was very unstable. So the parliament has changed, the political crisis every other year, changes in parliament, and the country was largely divided between pro-Western and pro-Russian. So east of Ukraine was always sort of more in favor of Russia. The west of Ukraine was more sort of pro-European Union. And that resulted in the rising of the crisis and changes in some presidents of Ukraine were more pro-Western and others were pro-Russian. So at some point, the people got very upset and they started protests in Ukraine. That eventually resulted in the government made some mistakes, but the point is that at the end it resulted in overthrowing the government. Yeah, it's like a small revolution in Ukraine. Well, small revolution, and it's not exactly constitutional, and Russia took it as a personal insult. So basically, Russia looked at what happened in Ukraine as something which is potentially dangerous for Russia. Yeah? If we let Ukraine to become pro-Western, and reorient the trade policies towards Western Europe, and potentially, again, they were on track to become the members of the European Union, which is a very long perspective, but still, symbolically. So basically, Russia did not want what happened to Ukraine to happen in Russia. So the reaction of Russia to what happened in Ukraine can be explained by the unwillingness of this by basically managing the the information flow. So they don't want Russian people to say, oh, Ukrainians can do it, so maybe we can do it. So what happened next was the following. In Crimea is a small part of Ukraine which used to be Russian. And then in the 1960s, Russian leader Khrushchev, he just, since it was the same country, he just changed the borders and Crimea became part of Ukraine. But that happens, right? I mean, there's nothing we can change now, given that we signed an agreement with Ukraine that we're not going to dispute the territory. Now, but but Russia always felt like, well, it's ours, right? I mean, it's ours, it's ours. And there are some territorial disputes between Russia and China too, right? There's an island, nobody wants this island, but it's a matter of principle, right? It goes underwater and then it appears again, and then the countries dispute, no, it's ours, no, it's yours, it's ours. It's not because it's a matter of principle. So the same here. And then probably with the help of security forces, some protests were organized in Crimea. Yeah? Some protests were organized in Crimea for which said they want independence. Yeah? So any part of the country has a right to independence. So that's what happens there. So formally, Russia did not invade Crimea, but it looked like Crimeans themselves wanted to become independent of Ukraine, where the anti-constitutional coup happened, and that's what happened. And then some people, so formally a Russian army was not there, but there are a lot of indicators that it was just a Russian army with no identification, right? And it was just undercover operation. And then the referendum was organized very quickly, which widely viewed as illegitimate. And 97% of voters said, yes, we want to be part of Russia. And then the Russian parliament says, fine, you want to be part of Russia, now you're part of Russia. So it became, and that's what we mean by annexation. Of course, it doesn't matter what happened in Ukraine was anti-constitutional, but this is not acceptable nowadays in the international community, to this annexed part of another country. But despite that, the international community reacted, obviously criticized Russia for that, but it was not a critical factor. What happened next became more critical. So again, what happened in Crimea, which became part of Russia, also gave a signal to eastern Ukraine. The cities like Donetsk, Lugansk, where some people also decided that, well, we want to be independent of Ukraine. But instead of negotiating and doing it gradually, we just gonna start a war. Again, with some help from Russia, probably. But formally, Russia says, no, we are not there, these are just local rebels. But someone helped these local rebels, someone gave the guns. So obviously, it's no doubt Russia is involved in one way or another. And, there's pretty much anarchy there. There are fights between Ukrainian army and these rebels. There's no end in sight. Situations that are highly destabilized. So the sanctions of the Western countries, US and the European Union in particular, but many other countries, introduced sanctions on Russia. Trade sanctions like restrictions on investment, restrictions against some individuals, and Russian politicians, and what happened again, another critical factor which changed the situation was shooting down Malaysian passenger plane over eastern Ukraine. Again, it's still not, it hasn't been concluded. I mean, nowadays, you've heard about the attempt to set up a tribunal, in the United Nations, which Russia blocked, the attempts to do that. So, there's a lot of criticism, on how investigations is undertaken on these issues. Now, again, what happened, Russia, in response to the sanctions, introduced its own sanctions, so decided to punish the European Union by introducing food ban. Okay? So Russia imports a lot of food from Ukraine, so they decided, oh, why don't we, from Ukraine, from the European Union, so they decided, we can punish European Union by not buying their food. But in a sense, they punished themselves more than the European Union. In fact, I can show you numbers that the export of fruits and vegetables, of food export from European Union quickly recovered and actually increased. Yeah, they just reoriented their selling elsewhere. But Russia, does need this food import, so it created more problems in Russia than I think for the European Union. Plus, obviously, in the environment of sanctions and high uncertainty about what's going to happen next, the investment, the level of investment, the economic activity, obviously, in the background also exchange rates, interest rates, the economy is in recession, basically. So there are a lot of problems, and there's a high uncertainty about how soon these problems can be solved. And they're unlikely to be solved, from my point of view, they're unlikely to be solved as long as Putin remains in power. So I don't think Western governments, even if China tries to sort of mediate and help, I don't think Western governments will negotiate with Putin. I don't think this is, this is realistic. He kind of burned the bridges, and there is no coming back. And I'll come back to these issues. So this is very important. They changed the whole sort of outlook for Russia. Again, in order for Russia, so again, the Russian government used the situation to consolidate power, and they were able to do that because they control mass media. So again, in a sense, similar to China, the major television channels are state-controlled. Yeah? So basically what we hear from the television channels nowadays is that the world, the Western world is against us, we need to defend ourselves. There's a lot of sort of, criticism of Western values, ideological criticism. For example, gay marriages were legalized in the US, and in some European Union countries. That's horrible. They're gonna burn in hell, and Russia is will save the world because we don't allow this type of things. So again, all the conspiracy theories that someone wants Russia to be weak, someone wants Russia to be to fail. Again, another motive is that we're gonna, instead of being friends with the US and the European Union, we're gonna become friends with China, so we don't need the West. So again, that's another thing. We're gonna sign we're gonna supply gas instead of Europe. We're gonna supply gas to China. China says yes, but it's still uncertain at what price and at what conditions. So again, I think Russia was over-optimistic about dealing with China, and China is, from my point of view, is absolutely rationally waits until Russia gets weak and you get a better price, right, for resources. So this is absolutely a brilliant situation. I mean, you don't want to you don't want to depend on one buyer, right, in a sense. So, but if that's what they do, I mean, there's not, it's up to them. And what they continue is the hybrid war in Ukraine, which means that it's not an official war, but it costs money. So they spend a lot of money on military sector, they spend a lot of money on helping rebels, and this is not the only area where there's a conflict. Remember that a few years ago there was a war with Georgia, where Russia again helped to Abkhazia and South Ossetia to become independent. So again, there's a Transnistria, which used to be part of Moldova, another Russian republic. So there are territories, where Russia is involved. And for me, as an economist, what's important is that it costs money, right? And Russia has money, but eventually it's likely to run out of money. So again, it's a big country, and inside, in general, the expenses are large, so you need to make money to spend money. And that's how the Soviet Union fell, right? I mean, it was a military race between the US and Russia, and all these military expenses, they came from somewhere, and this somewhere was living standards of Russians, right? And so Russians were sacrificing living standards in order to build nuclear missiles. So at some point, again, given that Russia depends on natural resources, it has an under-diversified economy, and I'll show you this, the structure of imports and exports. When the oil prices go down, like now, partly because of the slowdown in China, we have a problem, right? So again, if oil prices were $150 per barrel now, the situation would be very different. So again, very tight control of non-government organizations, very tight control. So every day in Russia, it becomes more and more difficult to speak against the policies of the government. It becomes almost like, it becomes dangerous, right? To be in a position, to be vocal against Putin, to say something against Putin. There is some violence, I mean, still under control, but the trends are very disturbing. I mean, it's getting, it's getting very ideological in a sense. It looks very sort of, becomes looking similar to what it was during the Soviet, during communism. There are some disturbing trends. But, in general, it's still the market economy. There are private businesses, there are rich people, and they continue to make money. The government interferes, but it's still possible to conduct business. Yeah, if you manage the relationship well. Now, if you look at the numbers of support for Putin, you'll see that Putin is very popular in Russia. Reasons for that: 80% support. Again, 80% you can believe in these numbers, you can be skeptical about these numbers, but it's true, he's very popular. One reason is that, if television tells you, how great Putin is every day, and then you start believing it. People don't speak English, right? People don't watch CNN. People watch Russian television. Russian television says, Putin is a macho man, and he's flying a plane, and he's shooting a gun, and killing a lion. So he's a great man. Second is that when Putin came to power in the year 2000, after Yeltsin, when he took over Russia, he implemented some good reforms. So there was a lot of improvement in the Russian economic environment. So in his first sort of 8 years in power, Russian economy grew almost as fast as China, right? I mean, the average growth rate was like 6%, between 98 and 2000. Again, partly that was because of the record high oil prices, partly that was because Putin, did some, implemented some good reforms in Russia. So that cannot be taken from him. It's a matter of academic discussion, which part comes from oil prices, which comes from Putin's reforms. Look, and what bottom line is that people got richer. In 10 years, people got a lot richer. The household consumption rose on average by 9% annually. Every year, you roughly become wage growth. 15% increase in wages every year. So basically, Russia went from the middle income economy to, formed by the World Bank classification, by high income economy. So comparable to, to a lot of, actually probably richer than China, in terms of GDP per capita. So people started to feel, again, proud of their country. People started to feel sort of entitled to their wealth. People started to feel the gap about the loss of geopolitical sort of importance of Russia. Yeah? Suddenly, you move from the Russian car to, the credit market started to work. Again, you see it in China also every day. People are taking credit to buy a new car. You buy a Volkswagen, or you buy an SUV, you buy a flat, you got a job, you start going abroad for vacations. So it's all good. And in their minds, it's all because of Putin. Right? So it's due to Putin's leadership. So that's one of the explanations for Putin's popularity. Right? So again, living wages, 150% between 1990,000. Obviously, everyone in Russia has more than one mobile phone. Look at again, very similar to China. Look at what happened to the real estate prices in Moscow. $700 per square meter at the end of '99. Yeah, to 6,000 per square meter in the summer of 2008. Shanghai probably, yeah, similar, even more here in Shanghai. So once again, remember, and you remember what happened in Russia. If you had the flat during communism, the flat became yours when the market reform started. So people who had apartments in the past, right, before the 90s, they just received the apartments for free. You see, so a lot of people don't need to buy. A lot of people own what state used to give them. So if you live in Moscow, right, if my grandmother had an apartment in Moscow, I would have $500,000, or 1 million, could easily have $1 million, yeah, represented by these apartments. I could just live in London, rent this apartment in Moscow, and receive £2,000 every month. It's a nice life, right? I mean, so again, especially Moscow, St. Petersburg, very expensive, very high rents. So a lot of people, you move to Thailand and you live off the income from your flats, which you didn't even buy, right? I mean, it just happened. Someone had it, someone did not have it. So again, that creates a sense of, of comfort, right? I mean, that people don't understand how the economy is integrated with the rest of the world. So they say that, oh, actually, the rest of the world needs us. Yeah? Europe needs our gas. So if we turn off the gas, Europe will come and beg us, because they're going to freeze to death in the winter. But they don't understand the market economy. When the economy slows down, right? When China slows down, suddenly the oil prices goes down. Yeah? And when it's a warm winter in Europe, then Russia produces more gas than is required in the West. So it's not exactly true, right? I mean, Russia cannot control, nobody can control the oil and gas prices. Countries can try to influence it, but there's no control, and you don't want to be dependent, so Russia was aware of that, so they tried to talk about diversification, promoting entrepreneurship and diversifying economy away from oil and gas. So again, the idea is that you make a lot of money in oil and gas, and then you invest them in high technologies. But again, for that you need good institutions. Good institutions means that if the government gives you money, but then the government bureaucrat asks you for a big bribe, right? If the bribe is required, then basically the money you receive net of this bribe are not enough to do the project you want to do. So that's the bad part of Russian corruption, right? And China is also, not free from corruption. India is not free from corruption. But there are different types of corruption, right? In China, for example, there is a corruption, but but first of all, when occasionally the bureaucrats are killed, right? They receive capital punishment when they are caught, yeah, taking bribes. And second of all, the job has to be done, right? China has transformed its infrastructure enormously. There are nice roads, right? I mean, which actually work, and the good quality roads, and it's a huge country. In Russia, it's a matter of corruption leads to these projects not being implemented properly. Either the money are stolen and the job is not done, or the job is often done poorly. Right? You build the road, but it's a bad quality road, so the money are wasted, and then we need to repair this road just in a few years. Plus, since most of the infrastructure investment and a lot of in general investment comes from the government, right? So the government controls who receives this money. So there is a corruption in terms of allocation of this money. Yeah, the closer you are to the government, the more likely you are to get the money. So not a very efficient system. So then there is no miracle, right? I mean, if I receive $1 million and I need to give away 200,000, how can I complete the project with 800,000 if I need more? So basically, I can as well, if I pay the bribe of 20% of my project, I can as well steal the rest of the money, because the punishment for stealing 100,000 is not dramatically different from the punishment of stealing 500,000. Right? So if I steal some, I can as well steal almost everything and just move to London. So, but again, the poverty, inequality went down enormously, so less extreme poor. Let's look at some numbers, right? I mean, I'm an economist, so it's interesting to look at numbers. For example, from your perspective, right, investing in China, investing in Russia has to be evaluated vis-a-vis investment in other countries which are similar. Agree? Yeah? Because Russia is not the only destination, right? If you want to build a plant, Chinese are very active in Eastern Europe. Yeah? Eastern Europe became part of the European, especially before it became part of the, some countries became part of the European Union. Why? Because you invest in these countries, they become part of the European Union, you receive access to the market. Right? They also have educated, some of these countries like Poland or Czech Republic, they have educated workforce and infrastructure. So there are a lot of advantages. In fact, some of them are, richer than Russia. So if you look at this, GDP per capita, obviously Russia is the biggest economy, so the gross GDP is the largest, by far larger than the closest country from the sort of transition region. Right? So I'm comparing Russia to countries which used to be part of the socialist camp. Yes, so the Soviet Union, and there was a bunch of countries which were also part of the socialist camp. So again, Russia is not the richest country, somewhere in the middle in terms of GDP per capita. In terms of growth, it wasn't the fastest growing either as of 2014. So the growth has been slowing down, and now actually it's negative. In 2015 it's likely to be minus 3.6%. But it was pretty small even in 2014. Inflation-wise, again, inflation is picking up too, so which is a very disturbing trend. So you see, Russia is like a ride, right, on the in the amusement park. Up and down, up and down. So here we have global financial crisis, 2009, huge fall in the GDP. Currently, not as big, but still pretty big dip due to the problem with sanctions, right? Inflation, again, also very volatile. Picking up, so again, historical trend, it's not as high as the historical trend, but still picking up. I'll show you the exchange rate. Again, you can clearly see that, in the last few years, since 2010, the industrial production, both manufacturing and even mining, which Russia depends on, has been going down, so there's a dramatic decline in the recent period. So very disturbing trends. But again, from the point of view of investment, I mean, this disturbing trend can indicate that things are likely to get cheaper, right? I mean, so again, if you're a businessman and the bad news from the economy can potentially mean good prices, right? I mean, good valuations. So in that sense, I mean, it can be interpreted as not something. So buying something at the bottom is a good idea. Guessing where the bottom is more difficult to do. As many people investing in Chinese stock market discovered recently. It cannot go down that much. Yes, it can. So imports and domestic demand. Again, remember sanctions against the EU. So imports, look, it's almost over 20% decline in imports and domestic demand. So people have less money, and that's exports are also down, right? Lower oil prices, the growth in exports. Interest rates, yeah, there was pressure on ruble exchange rate, so the central bank had to raise interest rates almost to the level of observed during the global financial crisis to protect ruble. Well, remember the exchange rate in Russia plays a dual role because it benefits exporting industries. Yeah, so if you are selling oil, obviously you are selling it for dollars, so weaker ruble is a good news. But if you are buying English cheddar cheese, then it's going to get expensive, right? I mean, so if you're importing. So so overall, even the central bank intervention, the exchange rate depreciated a lot, and that puts a pressure on foreign exchange reserves of the Russian central bank. And the reason is that economy has deteriorated, but has not in a complete disarray. It could be worse, but the explanation for that is Russia came to both global financial crisis and to the current crisis more or less prepared. In a sense that, similar to China, Russia accumulated a lot of reserves. The external debt is low, so basically Russia has money. The question is, will this money be sufficient? For how long can you use this money for? Yeah? 2 years, and that's uncertain, right? So again, I think the hope of the Russian government was that the oil price will go back, right? So we'll be able to afford sort of this latent war with the West. We're going to be sort of more or less closed economy, right? We're going to close from the West. We're going to be self-sufficient. We're going to control the ideology, and oil prices will continue to, so will allow us to maintain living standards. So again, people reach a particular level, right? Now, for the government to remain in power, it's important for people to remain at this level, right? If people's living standards will go down, eventually Putin will become less popular. So now the excuse is, the idea is, well, again, since we definitely cannot maintain the same living standards, we'll just emphasize ideology saying that your living standards deteriorated, but that's because the world is against us, so you have to be strong, right? We're in war. So again, budget balance from surplus, it's going into deficit. Money has to come from somewhere, and they are expected to come from the National Wealth Fund. And there are two of them, right? So basically, money the government saves for the future. The money from oil and gas revenues the government saves for the future are put into National Wealth Fund and National Reserve Fund, which are sovereign wealth funds. So now the money are drawn from these sources for various purposes. So again, in general, Russia has a room for maneuver because public debt is relatively low. I mean, this is comparison with the, if you look at Russia compared to the world and to Eastern Europe, the public debt is relatively low. Now, remember I told you about undiversified Russian economy? Here you go. Principal exports, 71.5% of exports is oil, fuel, and gas. That's huge, right? And what Russia imports, probably a lot from China, is machinery and equipment. So you produce something which is lower value added, and you buy something which is high value added. So that's not, that's not a good, good strategy for the long-term development. So back to the effect of the recent crisis, wage growth. Again, good news, if you invest in Russia, so Russian labor is getting cheaper. Huge decline actually, because of the this is percentage change, right? And huge decline in both nominal and real wages. You see the gap between nominal and real increased because inflation is faster than the nominal wage growth. Do we feel it? Of course. Retail sales, right? I mean, if you're selling something, your business is selling, again, you're in troubles because a lot of retail sales come from imports, so weaker ruble translates directly into higher retail prices, right? In Russia, the key is that nowadays there's a discussion between the strategy of liberalization and import substitution. So the government has not clear strategy on that, but in general, yes, they're pointing more towards import substitution, meaning that, okay, we have a ban, we don't buy European food, then Russian farmers will produce more food, right? And we're going to use Russian food. But that's, first of all, it cannot be done, right? The agriculture cannot quickly increase the output, I mean, it takes years. And second of all, the government does not often realize that, for example, yes, I can produce something in Russia, but for example, I need fertilizers. Fertilizers need to come from somewhere, and very often they come from the same countries which we impose the sanctions against. Right? So again, imports are everywhere, so Russia is not self-sufficient in most of the things, except mineral resources. So Russia cannot be independent of the rest of the world. China can fulfill the gap. So China definitely benefits from, from the actions of Russia in terms of increased, export to Russia. But even China cannot fulfill all the gaps because certain things, China is buying things, and China is not self-sufficient either. So again, exchange rate, I think it's back to this, and just in the last few days, there's been downward pressure. Just to give you a magnitude, a year or two ago, I mean, the pound was 50 rubles, now it's over 100. Right? So that's a huge hit to the economy. And that, is not surprising, given high dependence of Russian oil and gas exports and decline in oil and gas prices, historically low. So you see, I mean, that makes a huge difference in this level or that level. Let me skip the human capital and let me go into business climate, which is very interesting. So business climate is the issue which has been widely debated in Russia, because until recent times, the strategy was to attract as much investment as possible to Russia and to transform Russia, for example, Moscow into financial center, similar to Shanghai, for example. I think China has been ahead of this in this trend, but basically Moscow tried to do the same. Unlike in China, that was mostly about claims, not as much has been done as in China. But still, in Moscow, you have a financial center, you have high rises, again, not as massive as in Shanghai or Beijing, but it's there. So in general, joint ventures and attracting foreign investment was a clear strategy, which Russia, to a certain extent, succeeded in. So I'll show you the numbers on FDI, foreign direct investments. Among the BRIC, until recently, Russia was had the highest FDI per head, per capita among all BRIC countries. Well, that's because there are a lot of people in China. So when you divide FDI by billion to get a small number. But business, so again, one way, obviously, the critical factor to attract investments is to improve business climate. What does it include? And what the problem was? Well, Russia scores poorly on radio indicators of the business environment, such as state involvement in the economy, again, not dissimilar from China, corruption, endemic corruption, and the rule of law is weak. So again, something, if you have a legal dispute, I mean, it's not going to be resolved efficiently, not always. And again, foreign trade and investment regimes are relatively restricted. That historically resulted in low levels of competition, which is perhaps good for businesses, which don't face competition, but it's definitely not good for the economy. Sluggish innovation, low investment, and greater dependence on natural resource extraction. So let's see how Russia ranks in the various areas of business plan. So what I'm going to use is the information which is available in public domain, so you might be aware of it, is the World Bank's project on doing business. So every year they conduct surveys in China, India, in 189 countries. They concentrate only on selected cities. So I think in China it's Beijing and Shanghai, in Russia it's Moscow and St. Petersburg. So in a sense, the rank you observe here is the upper part of the rank, because obviously these are major cities. Like in China also, in situations, business climate in Shanghai is definitely better than in some, in other provinces, in other smaller cities. So among 189 countries, Russia is ranked, even as of 2015, I mean these are numbers, as 62, so not too bad. Which is an improvement from previous years. 2014 it was 64. And look at this. The topics which are covered are starting a business, dealing with construction permits, getting electricity, registering property, getting credit, protecting minority investors, paying taxes, trading across borders, enforcing contracts, and resolving insolvency. So these are regarding. So if you look, there are some improvements in a lot of areas, like starting a business and dealing with construction permits. The rank of Russia has improved. In some areas, there is a slight decline or no change. Another way of looking at that, this is just a rank, right? So maybe if another country has improved things more than you did, right, more than Russia, then it can result in lower rank, but not because Russia has done a poor job, because someone else has done a better job. So to overcome this issue, they also report indicator of distance to frontier. So basically, let's say the best country would have 100, right? This is percentage. So Russia, this is interpreted that Russia is roughly 8% below the best practices, right? And 92 would indicate. So 100 means that you have the best practices. Low number indicates how far you are from the best practices, and you can see that in terms of getting closer to frontier with best practices, Russia has been successful. There is an improvement in almost all areas except resolving insolvency. So there are some improvements. One can be skeptical about the methodology, but again, at least they use the same. It's very hard to find an organization which uses the same methodology in a number of countries, right? In order to make a comparison. So once again, 60. What does Nakano mean? If you look at this number, it says like dealing with construction permits, you are 156 out of 188 countries. So that's pretty low. You might think that this is crazy, right? And probably I don't wanna do construction business in Russia because it seems like in other countries it's much easier. So one way of getting a realistic picture is to compare it to other countries. So over here I compare it to the other big economies. Yeah? Russia, China, Brazil, India. When you look at the comparison, then even the dealing with construction permits, well, according to the World Bank, it's more difficult, although Russia, the impression you get is that Russia is 156 out of 189, well, China is ranked 179. So according to these indicators, even now it's more difficult to deal with construction permits in China, Brazil, and India than in Russia. So you see, everything has to be viewed in comparison. And in a lot of other areas is the same, right? So again, especially if you look at China, overall rank, actually China is, the overall doing business rank of China is 90, while in Russia is 62. But again, it doesn't mean that, remember, when you think about finance, if the business environment is less attractive, yeah, that can result in a premium, yeah, you receive. So basically, the fact that China is ranked lower than Russia does not mean that as a business we will make less money in China than in Russia, right? In fact, you can make more money in China. It's just a number of problems. So again, the magnitude of problems is not necessarily indicative of the level of profits, yeah, you realize when you overcome these problems, or the cost of this, how much money does it cost to have to resolve these problems. So again, we are almost out of time. So let me also talk about policy towards private enterprises and competition. So as I said, the involvement of government is pervasive in Russia, which often results in certain restrictions for particular areas. Yeah? And these restrictions, so there is a law on strategic industries, so the foreign ownership in strategic industries is restricted. Antitrust framework, competition framework has been modernized in the recent years, and there are a lot of improvements in these areas. Intellectual property rights remain pretty weak area. Yeah? So again, if you go on the internet and then you want to download something, Russia is still the safe haven for illegal downloads. So the property rights, in general, which is less problem than, for example, for the business which tries to produce something information sensitive, so you don't want your product to be copied, and then you cannot protect your patents. So that remains a problematic area. Again, not very dissimilar to other countries. In general, the Russian government has been aware of these problems, and but very often what they say is very different from what they do. So you hear all the right claims, but very often not enough is done in practice. So again, the strategic sector which I mentioned, which was introduced in 2008, placed limits on foreign investment in 42 sectors. Later it's been relaxed, so now, for example, foreign investors can acquire up to 25% of strategic oil, gas, or mining companies without first obtaining government approval. Which is still, again, that's not an issue now because of the sanctions. So obviously, with the sanctions in place against individuals and against the economy as a whole, this is unlikely to materialize. After long negotiations, Russia became member of the World Trade Organization, WTO, but because oil and gas and the mineral resource extraction is not covered by the WTO rules. Basically, joining WTO, unlike China, right? I mean, it has relatively little implications for Russia. Plus, a lot of changes which Russia has to do as a member of the WTO will be implemented over in the long run. So basically, there is no major pressure from joining WTO to to Russia, but there are some, until recently, there has been some improvements, yeah, as a result of, I'll skip this. In terms of trading with Russia, the corruption and red tape, inefficiencies in the system have major implications for the cost of import-export business into Russia. Yeah? So basically, custom administration is known to be corrupt, and Russia is ranked pretty low in terms of trading overseas. Lots of permits, bureaucracy involved, sometimes it's a matter of bribing, sometimes it's just a matter of waiting for a long time. I'm sure this is something you are familiar with, being from a country which is not dissimilar in that respect. Taxes. Stuart mentioned that taxes is an issue in Russia. There have been some improvements. The major problem with tax collection is the uncertainty and sudden changes in the tax system. Means that not necessarily the magnitude of taxation, but in terms of changes which are introduced, and then businesses need to compliance with these changes. So very often, they introduce changes. You have to watch yourself for these changes. If you don't comply with these changes, you are penalized as a business. So the corporate tax is reasonable. It's been reduced from 24 to 20%. Obviously, corporate tax is not the only tax we pay. So I looked it up, and the overall taxes for businesses in Russia, if you're going to pay taxes in Russia. Because alternatively, you can have a business if you reach with Russian double taxation treaty, so in principle, you can pay the taxes in the country you are from if the double taxation treaty is signed, and if you are not viewed as a tax resident. So in general, you need legal advice, you need to hire a company which will advise you on complying with the taxes and the difference between. So sometimes the taxes are specific to a particular industry, so obviously oil and gas are taxed differently than often taxed differently than other industries. So there are a lot of things. So the overall tax rate is about 50%. In addition to taxes, there are no non-tax charges. Yeah, you need to pay. And there are about 70 of them. I mean, just to illustrate the complications in the tax system, right? When your accountant has to keep in mind 70 different things which needs to be paid. I mean, that can become cumbersome, especially the penalty is harsh. So, taxation simplifying, making tax system, not taxation necessarily, but the tax system more friendly to businesses is still a big issue, given that, if someone doesn't like your business, right, they can, for example, and they have friends in the tax authorities, they can send tax authorities to your business, and the tax authorities can always find problems, right? So you see, it's a type of country where, if someone wants to find problems in your business and penalize you, they'll be able to do that. So again, and that obviously has implications for the business environment. I mean, it's difficult to operate business when you are just walking on the landmine. One wrong step and your business is done. And obviously, again, in the corrupted states, what does it mean? It means that the more successful you are, the greater are the incentives, right? For example, to take over your business. You understand what I'm talking about? So basically, if we are running two businesses in Russia, again, and I have friends in the tax authorities, right? For example, I want to take over your business. What can I do? Well, I can create problems in your business, so you would have to sell. Right? You're going to be either near bankruptcy, or you're going to face a big penalty. So this type of mechanisms are not uncommon, and that's a potential danger. With foreigners, less often, but with Russian businesses, yes, highly concentrated, two or three large enterprises. So you can use methods which are not strictly. So in the 90s, people with guns were used for that. Yeah? It was mafia, and since Putin came to power, the days of criminal methods are gone. So now it's done mostly through the through the government, local authorities or government authorities. So now the criminals, some of the criminals, they became legitimate businessmen. So nobody shoots guns nowadays. You send a taxman. It's not a gun. It's a man with a notepad. Yeah, not the man with the gun. And strictly speaking, it's all by the book, right? And you're violating the rules, and you face the penalty. It's just someone else benefits. Banking market, yeah, banks. Again, banking system has been created from scratch. Huge boom in the last 10 years. Huge boom in consumer and commercial lending. Yeah. Basically, some years the growth in consumer lending has been up to 30%. 30% increase from a very low base, but 30% increase in 1 year in the volume of consumer credit. And guess what? There is no credit check system in Russia. So basically, banking, there is no credit registry. So the banks are lending to people, but they don't know the credit history. There is no centralized system, which has been introduced only now. So what does it mean? Well, it means that the banks are doing well when the economy is doing well. But when the economy is in decline, what's already happening is that people start defaulting on their loans. Make sense? People cannot repay their loans, so the level of loans in arrears is growing. The delinquent loans are also growing, and that puts pressure on the banking system, which is sort of under-diversified. So the government, first of all, they cut consumer and commercial credit, as you can see here. So it's gone down dramatically, and the government has to step in again. So we are going back to the issue of spending money. The government has to spend money to keep the banks, some banks alive. Became an issue. So again, problem for the banking system, which is again crucial for the economy. Let me skip the issue of labor markets, which are sort of, okay, they're not bad in the sense that it might be difficult to find the people with the right skills for your business. So again, Russia is well educated, but sometimes the skills people have, they're not practical enough, right? When practical businesses come, there are a lot of people to choose from, but to find the right people is sometimes difficult, right? Or, it's expensive. So in general, the wage level is low, but if you need, a computer guy, who's well educated and good skills, right? You have to pay them a good salary, and you're facing competition. So there are certain skills which are in short supply, and you have to pay premium. So, for example, the wage growth I mentioned in Moscow, St. Petersburg, it has implications for the cost of businesses. Right? It's easier to do business in Moscow, St. Petersburg, but you need to pay people, Western wages because people, feel entitled. They say, oh, if you don't pay me in Moscow, I have friends, in Russia, in London, who decided to go back to, some years ago, who decided to go back to Moscow because they could make more money in Moscow in financial sector, right? Investment banking. They could make more money in Moscow than in London. And trust me, doing investment banking in London is tougher than doing investment banking in Moscow. So the reason it was, they were paying more in Moscow because they had to pay more to attract people, right? Because if you don't pay anymore, I'm not moving from London. Infrastructure, remember I mentioned roads and stuff like that, so it's still difficult. So if you're involved, if you want to invest in the business, which requires transportation, right, a lot of transportation, that's going to be tough. The road infrastructure in Russia is not sufficiently developed. In fact, most of the stuff is using railway system. Trans-Siberian, which goes all the way to China, Trans-Siberian Railway, and other. So again, in fact, Russian Railways, I think, is the biggest public employer in Russia. It employs the most people. And the head of Russian Railways is a close friend of Putin, so they are kind of, one gang. So the head of railways, extremely rich person. So he's got in his house, allegedly in his house, he's got a room which is probably 5 times this room just for his purpose. Not clothes, only purpose. This is very Russian style. Yeah. And guess what? He's got 2 sons. One is running hedge funds in London and one in Switzerland. Yeah, so again, we are talking multi-billions. I mean, this is part of in Forbes 100. There are lots of Russian billionaires. And Russia used to have the highest number of millionaires, in the world. And then there are billionaires. But a lot of these billionaires are not on the list because they are government officials. Right? But again, allegedly, they've got billions. The press secretary of Putin recently had a wedding. The press secretary of Putin, he's not even government official, he's a press secretary, not the one who communicates with the press. He had a wedding, and on his wrist, he had watch costing $500,000 US. So that kind of is indicative. And he said his wife gave it to him as a present. I mean, it's a good present. so what I'm trying to say, it's not just because it's interesting, because even though Chinese bureaucrats can also, some of them can afford to buy $500,000, but they would never do it because there is a credible punishment to that, right? You show up with this watch, and that your career is over, you're gone. Probably you're gonna go to prison, or you're gonna, get capital punishment. So that's the problem in Russia, that there is leniency towards that. So if there is no credible punishment, they feel like not only that they can divert some funds, but they feel relaxed about showing their wealth. Right? So it's better to steal, to get money when you make money, and then you divert your little money. But this is not the case. Okay, let me FDI. You can just look through the. Yourself, determine FDI, so that depending on what business you're in, there are a lot of opportunities still in Russia, especially if you come from China. Usually, the way of the level of entry would depend on the region. Right? Because FDI in general are very concentrated across several regions. Most of the FDI is officially registered in Moscow, St. Petersburg. Then there are a lot of FDI in sort of far east of Russia, close to China. Again, most of the FDI is related to extraction of mineral extraction, oil and gas exploration. But there are other sort of opportunities. Again, there are increasing opportunities in the agricultural sector in Far East, which which are offered to China, etc. In general, the way you work is that you try to investigate things at the regional level. So one thing I mentioned in my notes is that there is a huge difference across Russian regions. So some, I mentioned there are 89 of them. So some of these regions and republics are more investor-friendly than others. So again, my speech was mostly about Russia in general, but obviously when you decide on what you want to invest in, you also decide on, you also look at the region, right, and the geographic area you're going into. Who the governor is, what were the policies, other investors. So again, obviously agglomeration is important in Russia, meaning that if there are already a lot of foreign businesses in the area, it's likely for you to be, it's likely to be easier to do business because you can look at the and how they feel and then there is a sort of interactions. So obviously the regional aspect is extremely important. Overall, in terms of outlook, there is a lot of uncertainty, because of what happens in Ukraine, and this uncertainty is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. So in terms of making predictions, I'm not into making predictions. The only predictions is that we are unlikely to see any improvements in the Russian economy in the next year and a half. A lot will depend on oil prices, oil and gas prices, but even with higher oil and gas prices, situation is unlikely to improve dramatically, immediately. So what's also important is political situation, who is in power, and if Putin goes, who's gonna take over after Putin. Because at the moment it looks like it's all a lot depends on this, and the system is not transparent, so we don't know. There is no clear successor, and with the policy the government is undertaking now, the nationalistic moods are on the rise, which is also disturbing for foreigners, right? Because in principle, China is a friend, but as you soon discover, people can be pretty racist, right? And so once you enter and you start doing business, if people feel nationalistic, and again, this type of moods exist in China too, I'm sure, right? So these nationalistic moods are not exactly promote investment and do not encourage foreigners to do business. So nationalistic and very often racist, etc., etc. So at the moment, China is welcome, but obviously there is a sense of, among a lot of people, there is a sense of insecurity. Oh, what if China at some point will get stronger and take over the territory? Right? So the military wise in China is also getting stronger. So there is this type of geopolitical considerations for the long run. At the moment, the examples of cooperation which I want to mention is, which you might be aware of, which emerged from this recent summit of Asia, right, and countries and BRIC countries and Russia, is Big Bang. Have you heard about Big Bang in Omsk? So basically, the China and Russia and a bunch of other countries, they created a development bank recently called Big Bang as an alternative to the World Bank. In addition to that, China is a leading country in the Asian Infrastructure Bank. It's another project, 100 billion capital. So again, Russia is in favor of this project, which are organized as an alternative to the Western system of financial institutions. So the idea is, if another crisis comes, we're gonna have we're gonna have a reserve fund, yeah, across mutual insurance in the emerging markets, which will be able to, so instead of going to IMF, International Monetary Fund, will go to this big bank, for example, yeah, or another, there's some other institution. Of course, well, first of all, China is definitely the largest player in these institutions. Second of all, these institutions are not big enough to serve the clear alternative to the existing system, right? So if it's a big crisis, you'll have to go to IMF anyway, because the institutions they organize are not, they don't have enough capital, they're not sufficiently large to to stabilize the situation. But in general, I mean, it's a welcoming trend in terms of cooperation between countries. Also, the Greek bank, for example, would also finance various projects, cooperative projects between countries. So one infrastructure project, etc., can be financed from this. So that can also give boost to business development and to cooperation between countries. So that's so again, just last remarks. In general, Russia sort of faces the prospect of a long-term legitimacy crisis. I mean, that's a major issue. So basically, if in the past Russia could negotiate with the Western powers, now this negotiation power has somewhat decreased, and the willingness to negotiate with Russia has also decreased. So let me finish here, and then I'll let you ask questions. We have another 15 minutes, maybe 10-15 minutes.
We have maybe a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Guys, have we got any questions at all?
Come on.
Wait, one second.
Yeah.
如果你是中国人的话，你可以在俄罗斯投资嘛？如果是投资的话，你选择什么方向？
To start out with a question, if you send Chinese people perspective, if you send a Chinese businessman perspective, will you recommend the Chinese businessman to invest in Russia?
So Mr. Hans in the ERF says that he does.
And what kind of industry will you advise the Chinese businessman in startup?
Well, obviously, China is already trading also. Trading with Russia is definitely
in a individual position. For example, if I want to start a business in Russia, do you recommend should I go to Russia? Because as you mentioned so many.
Definitely not at the moment. I would say no, unless you can. Okay, let me put it this way. So if this is if you are in the agricultural business, right, and if you can get a long lease on land, in the territories far east, close to China, obviously, yeah, that's an attractive option. If you have in the area I'm from, the Chinese are running a huge business of hot houses. Hot houses growing vegetables, like huge factory. So because Russia is a huge market, you've got the technology. If you know how to do it, how to organize this business, right? Russia, is lacking these skills. So if you can produce vegetables and fruits and vegetables on the industrial scale, and again, one can be pretty sure that if you sign a long-term lease in Russia, that's fine. They're like it. So again, that's a good business in the sense that investment, it requires moderate level of investment. You build it fast, and you start, cash flow comes immediately. So at this point, I would encourage businesses with the payoff period, when you start making money pretty fast. Yeah? You build a hot house, you plant vegetables, and then the Russians start eating your tomatoes and cucumbers. Yeah? Something which pays in 6 years, I wouldn't recommend. You understand?
So, excuse me.
Yes.
So you recommend to develop the agriculture industry in Russia?
I see this as one realistic area, because for me, again,
it's kind of interesting because I first went to Russia in 1998, and I went to Siberia, it was very, very cold at that time. And at that time, it was really difficult to get fresh fruit and vegetables because they didn't have the capacity or the skills to do it. Now, if I go to Siberia in wintertime, I can get any fresh fruit or vegetable at any time of the year. Because as Eugene said, they've developed the ability to build these hot houses, these glass houses, on an industrial scale, and then actually produce more or less all year round.
Are they getting a good return?
It would be, well, put it this way, when I went to the city that I go to in Siberia, there was no large retail outlets. They were all small shops. Now it's like they had these hypermarkets, and this is a medium-sized city. It's not a particularly big city, and I was quite shocked because I got there in January, very cold, minus 26, 27, and there was fresh produce everywhere in these big, large, like Tesco's or places.
Let me put it this way again. What if you are building? Let's just take the example of hot houses, right? An agricultural business. What's the critical cost for this business? Energy, right? Because you need to lamp it, you need to heat it. Well, at the moment, Russia is very attractive in that respect because they, I don't know foreigners, but basically the energy prices are subsidized, so they're cheaper than the world price. But it's changing. So the next government prices has been gradually increasing. The business tariffs are kind of negotiated because it's not a market price, right? I mean, they're determined administratively. So the danger, of course, is that you enter the market. So you say that the return, adequate return, depends on the local government. Keeping the price the same. So if the energy prices go up, then your returns will go down. You can also in a lot of cases, you can build the business in Russia if you just need land and sell it in China, right? And it's not necessary. So there are different entry modes. So you can think of the businesses, using Russia, for example, to produce something to sell in the rest of the world, or entering Russia, to produce for the Russian market. Sometimes Chinese enter the Russian market because, for example, if you bring a car from China, for example, then you pay an import duty. But if you bring spare parts and assemble it in Russia, you can avoid this. That's what China did in Eastern Europe. So very often, for Chinese, you have a lot of capacity in China, so it's not always, about doing it cheaper in Russia. Sometimes it's a cheaper way to sell stuff in Russia. So in a lot of cases, you enter Russia because you're going to be subject to different tariffs. Yeah, it's going to be cheaper to produce in Russia, but in fact, so a lot of car manufacturing started like that. Ford and stuff like that. I mean, Ford is producing in St. Petersburg, BMW or Mercedes. Mercedes is producing in Kaliningrad. So they are basically, they started from pure assembly plants, but now, there's some production going on. But a lot of it is driven by, so you need to look at, first of all, two major, first of all, you need to see that what you produce can be sold in Russia, right? So either you can produce it in China and then sell it in the Russian market, and the Russian market 140 million, and it's great. It's better than sell it in Poland because, it's advertising, we just sell it to more people. And and then you can figure out that, maybe, if I have a stable market, if people know my product and they're buying it, maybe it's cheaper to start producing it in Russia. Yeah? But then it depends on your product. given that in Russia the situation is uncertain, right? I mean, the economy is going up and down. You have to look at whether your product is pro-cyclical or not, demand for your product. Yeah?
So
if you produce luxury cars, so for example, Chinese cars are, you know, there's a growing market for Chinese SUVs, car, the brand.
It's Great Wall, I think.
Yeah, great. So, but again, you know, when economy was doing well, right, when in China, people don't want to buy a Chinese Jeep, right, a Chinese SUV, because it's cooler to drive, you know, Mercedes-Benz. But when you have less money, suddenly, you know, so this segment of the market, you know, the economy is down, but that means that, you know, the demand for Chinese cars is likely to increase because they are objectively cheaper.
Can I suggest we go on outside, we can finish the questions outside because coffee is here, we're into coffee time already.